Good afternoon, everyone. It is good afternoon. I hope you can all hear me now. I am very pleased to give a warm welcome to everyone who's here. I think we have a large number of people participating in our event, and a welcome to the first in the series of military history program events. This is the 9/11 attacks from a historical perspective, with our speakers, Professor Peter Neumann and Suzanne Rain. Before I move into the next stage of the event, I just want to set out the sort of basic rules and remind you of the procedures we're following. The entire proceedings, including the Q&A, will be on the record. What we plan to do is for each of our speakers to talk, to give their thoughts and presentation, if you like, for 10 plus minutes. Peter Neumann will go first, and then Suzanne. And then I'll ask a couple of questions. We'll have a brief discussion amongst us, and then we will ask guests, participants, to come in with their questions. All questions should be placed in the Q&A, please, nowhere else. And don't be tempted on that point to go into chat. Q&A, and well, I'll be responsible for trying to select the right kind of questions for the discussion. That, as long as that's clear, thank you. Now, I want to turn to Professor Peter Roberts, Director of Military Sciences at RUSI, to introduce the new military history program. Peter.
Thanks very much, John, and thanks for chairing this event. Quite rightly, RUSI and my military sciences team in particular has been challenged by our members over the past couple of years because of our failure to cover military history as a discipline of our outputs. It's fair, and one we're recognising today by starting a programme of activities for the military history community and those that might wish to participate. We've managed to scrape together enough resources to fund a series of events over the next 12 months that we hope you might enjoy. I'm also delighted to announce that a former Director of Military Sciences, Mike Codner, has taken up the role of Senior Associate Fellow for Military History at the Institute and has taken personal charge of this set of activities. Our aim will be to conduct monthly events that inform, educate, challenge, and grow this community in a variety of ways. We're keen to expand that group with younger members, those currently in education or undertaking research, as well as those who can't afford to undertake full-time courses, especially from those outside the traditional interest areas of London and the metropolitan districts. I hope that we can build on the activity over the next 12 months and grow our audience, the community, and the opportunities for this group to link up better. And we're working on finding funding to continue this work beyond next year. The military history programme will shortly have its own webpage and will provide details about forthcoming events and activities. Please do sign up for the Military Sciences newsletter for updates on when this information becomes available. In the meantime, I'm looking forward to this first event. Back to you, Sir John.
Thank you very much, Peter. Now, I'm very pleased to be able to introduce our two speakers, Professor Peter Neumann and Suzanne Rain. First of all, Peter, Professor of Security Studies at the Department of War Studies, King's College London, who served as Director of its International Centre for the Study of Radicalisation from 2008 to 2018. 2017, he was the OSCE's Special Representative on Countering Violent Radicalisation, Senior Associate Fellow at the Egmont Services Institute in Brussels, and of course at RUSI. He also serves as an advisor to the Club de Madrid, the Association of Former Heads of State and Government. Now I will also introduce Suzanne, who is a trustee of Royal United Services Institute, who served in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office from 1995 to 2019, and her postings included Poland, Iraq in 2003, and Pakistan 2006 to 2009. But now she has worked primarily on national security issues, but she specialized in counterterrorism, and specialized is the right word there, because 2015 to 2017, she was head of the JTAC, the Joint Terrorism Analysis Center. You don't get much more specialized than that. She's an affiliated lecturer, Suzanne, at the Forum on Geopolitics, Cambridge University, and a member of the Board of Trustees at the Imperial War Museum. So two very well qualified speakers. Now it's my pleasure to pass to Peter.
Thank you, Sir John. It's a great honor to be here. 10 minutes is not a lot of time, but I'll try anyway. What are the historical roots of 9/11? There are plenty of great accounts that have been written by scholars like Tom Heghammer, by journalists like Lawrence Wright, even policymakers like Ali Soufan. On the one hand, tracking the emergence of Al-Qaeda out of jihadist networks fighting in Afghanistan in the 1980s, and on the other hand, documenting the failures of government agencies, security services in America and elsewhere in the run-up to the attacks. I cannot give you a summary of all this scholarship. What I want to do, or what I want to put to you, is there was an even bigger, or if you want, an overarching failure that actually unites all of these different accounts. And it's a failure that even after 9/11 wasn't completely rectified. In fact, it is something that I believe we're still struggling with and have struggled with throughout the war on terror. And that failure that I want to talk about, that failure is the failure to understand and define who our opponents are. Against whom are we at war? I'm going to briefly start with 1990s. There was a great reluctance, I would argue, to even confront the idea that there could be another big confrontation. Let's not forget, those were the good years. The West had just won the Cold War. Francis Fukuyama was speaking about the end of history. Tom Friedman was writing books about the inevitable spread of liberal capitalism across the world. The world was apparently getting flat, and China was becoming a democracy. If you read these books today, it almost sounds like a fantasy, but that was a predominant mood at that time. It was inconceivable that there would be another big confrontation. Of course, there were skeptics as well, but the predominant mood was that. So when the first World Trade Center attack happened, which happened in 1993, in early 1993, it was actually interesting that none of the indictments that came to court afterwards even mentioned the word terrorism. Ramzi Youssef, who was the mastermind of this attack and also the operational leader, was portrayed as an amateur, as a lone wolf, even though he'd trained in Afghanistan, even though he'd met Osama bin Laden, and even though his uncle was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. So he was still portrayed as something completely different from what we would portray him as today. And during the trials, in fact, that's also an interesting fact, the FBI produced a list of unindicted co-conspirators, of associates of Ramzi Youssef, which was essentially a Rolodex of what Al-Qaeda was at the time. What did the FBI do with that? Nothing. After the trial finished, they essentially filed it away. So there was an element of intelligence failure, of course, but I think it was bigger than that. It was, as the commission, the 9/11 commission said afterwards, it was a failure of imagination. This changed to some extent in 1998 with the East Africa embassy bombings. And many people in law enforcement security services became quite alarmed. Ali Soufan, for example, describes that very well in his books, that from that point onwards, he was traveling the world, tracking down various plots that were undertaken at that time. And at that point, in fact, security services picked up on this, were becoming alarmed, were starting to understand this is serious, plots are connected. Osama bin Laden isn't just a financier of terrorism, and this was more widespread, more complex than anything they'd ever seen. But as Ali Safan also says, it was difficult, if not impossible, to get political attention for this, to convince politicians, political leaders that this was a priority. And even Bill Clinton and Madeleine Albright in their autobiographies later admitted that beyond missile strikes, it would have been impossible for them to mobilize the public for tougher action against these training camps in Afghanistan. So it was not so much at that point a failure of intelligence services, who were quite alarmed about that. It was a failure to mobilize the public. It was a failure to mobilize political attention. Now, the bottom line is, of course, yes, I blame Tom Friedman. He'd helped create the sort of public mood in which basically it became inconceivable that there was a serious, organized, sustained, violent change to the liberal order, and that was even possible. Of course, I don't blame him personally, but I blame what he represented during that period. Now, that's really important, actually. This historical bit is really important if we want to understand what happened after 9/11. Because arguably, and that's my argument, the pendulum swung from one to the opposite direction. I'd argue that much of what happened after 9/11 is an expansive, unlimited war on terror. The mistakes and failures and abuses that resulted from an overestimation of the threat are actually a result, if not a direct consequence, of the failure of imagination, of the ignorance of that threat previously. Whereas before, nothing was terrorism, now everything was terrorism. And because people didn't have any parameters for estimating this threat, they erred on the side of panic. There was amongst the public an idea that these sorts of attacks would happen every month now, that Osama bin Laden would inevitably get hold of weapons of mass destruction if he didn't have them already. And David Frum, who worked in the White House at the time, once told me that White House meetings at that time were hair-raising. People would leave security briefings and be truly frightened because they had never received that information before. And of course, after 9/11, intelligence officers made sure that they wouldn't be blamed for another attack. So they filled the threat matrix with everything, absolutely everything they could find, presenting an absolutely horrific picture to policymakers. So in the absence of any proper understanding of what America was confronted with, Americans especially thought of Al-Qaeda as the new Soviet Union. That was a sort of framework they could understand. It was another Cold War, and a lot of policymakers, a lot of politicians articulated the threat in that way. And that, even though, of course, Al-Qaeda was dangerous, was still a complete overestimation. So the bottom line was that the shock of the 9/11 attacks and the lack of understanding combined to create a war on terror that was probably in many respects over the top. Now, the overreaction soon became obvious, not least because of Iraq, which is another story altogether. But Barack Obama came to office in 2009, and he, of course, didn't end the war on terror, but he scaled down the ambition of the war on terror. He said, we're no longer fighting the alphabet soup of Islamists. We are fighting against Al-Qaeda. We're fighting against the network that attacked us on 9/11. So he focused very much on what he called Al-Qaeda Central, affiliates of Al-Qaeda that were a threat to the West, and of course, homegrown terrorists. It was a direct consequence of that overreaction after 9/11. It sort of made sense. It was reasonable, but it again kind of failed to develop a proper appreciation who the enemy was. In contrast to Bush's war on terror, whose definition of the enemy was too wide, Obama's definition was too narrow. And I believe it actually helps to explain why for such a long time they missed or didn't have the ability to take seriously the rise of ISIS. Barack Obama wasn't just describing ISIS as a JV team. He was, in fact, just 4 weeks before the capture of Mosul by ISIS, in the West Point speech that he gave at the time, not mentioning ISIS at all. Quite astonishing, considering what was going on at that time. So even 10 or more years after 9/11, there still wasn't a good understanding who and what the enemy was. And so I'm going to conclude by saying this. This is, I believe, one of the important stories, historical stories and ongoing stories of 9/11, our failure to imagine who we are fighting and imagine and to define in a precise way who we are fighting. And the reason for that is, of course, on the one hand, perhaps we didn't think about it for a long time. On the other hand, it is that we are in conflict with a movement. We call it the jihadist movement. But this movement consists not of one organization, it consists of many organizations. It even consists of people who don't belong to any organizations at all. And on top of that, these organizations and that movement is constantly changing with boundaries that are constantly in flux. And so rather than defining our enemy, this is actually, I think, an ongoing task. We have to again and again ask ourselves who it is we are fighting, because the people we're fighting today may not be the same people we fought last year. And as very last word, of course, you see exactly that sort of question popping up now in relation to Afghanistan and the Taliban. Until 2 or 3 weeks ago, I think most people in this room would have not hesitated to say that the Taliban are our enemy. Now, 2 weeks later, we're saying, oh, wow, there's the Taliban, there's ISIS, there's Al-Qaeda, there's the Haqqani network, which is somewhat connected to the Taliban, but maybe we don't want that relation to be too close. So we're again engaged in a discussion about who it is that we're fighting in that conflict. And I think our answer to that question will determine how successful we will continue to be. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. That is a clear challenge to our discussion. And Suzanne, please, there's no pressure.
Thank you, Sir John. I don't disagree with anything Peter has said, I should say, and I hope that what I say will follow on neatly, and it may build on some of Peter's points for the discussion that follows. I'm going to start by saying this is about people, and we've talked so much over the last 20 years about policies, military strategies and capabilities and partnerships, but the harrowing footage from Afghanistan in the last week has made real to us again the fact that this terrorism is about human beings, the people who conduct the attacks, the people who are victims of the attacks, and the people who are trying to stop the attacks. And 20 years since 9/11, it's hard to find a family in the UK who hasn't been touched by the war on terror in some way. A not insignificant portion of the population will have family members or friends who served in Iraq and Afghanistan in the conflicts there. Many living in Muslim communities will have other perspectives, and one of the awful consequences of 9/11 and the response to it is that it has enabled within the West the creation or the perception of difference based on religion and culture, which didn't exist in the same way before. And this has changed how people identify themselves within communities and between them in extremely complicated ways. And of course, the victims of the terrorist attacks and their families are the hardest hit. In the case of the terrorists, we often don't see them until they conduct the attacks. And the priority has been, rightly, to find them and stop them committing terrorist attacks. And there have been, over the last 20 years, some remarkable and critical successes. But the focus on finding them and stopping them means that we've spent the last 20 years more concerned about where they are than about who they are. And this is almost exactly what Peter was saying, but we've spent so long finding out where they are, we still know frighteningly small amounts about them as people. And even now, we know very little about the people in leadership positions in the critical Islamist terrorist organizations that we would say we have been fighting the whole time. So take, for example, Saif al-Adil, who is the approximately 58-year-old Egyptian deputy leader of al-Qaeda, who has been in Iran for most of the last 20 years. And we're told that he's a pragmatist who operates with ruthless efficiency. But what do we really know about what he's thinking? What do we know about what his wife is thinking? Who are his rivals? What really annoys him? What kind of conversations is he having with his Iranian hosts? What kind of conversations is he having with the leaders of the Taliban? Because he was Osama bin Laden's main link person to the Taliban in the 1990s. So what's that conversation look like now? And it's only really with a deeper understanding of that sort of stuff that we'll move beyond this kind of sweeping commentary about Salafi jihadism and instead look at organizations which have leaders and members, each with their own life stories and ideals and commitment and ambitions. And if we knew more about the people that we're fighting, we would be able to have a more thoughtful conversation about what to do next. Obviously, you will all say, that's impossible because they're hiding from us. And therein lies the real challenge of counterterrorism. There's a serious practical problem about how to understand what's happening on the ground, about how to understand who the opponent is. Who do we talk to? Who do we trust? And so we fall back, or we have fallen back on data analysis, location information, telephone numbers, email addresses, as though that, I mean, it's critical, but it doesn't give us the picture. And President Biden's over the horizon capability will struggle to get beyond names and data. It will be vulnerable to misinformation and prejudice and manipulation, and it will miss opportunities to ask people why they're fighting against the West and to build an understanding that would inform better foreign policy decisions. So my first point is, if we really want to know our adversary, we need to build networks which reach directly to them. We need to get personal. We need to be in amongst them and really understanding the way they look at the world. The second point is about consistency and continuity. It's been so long since 9/11 that we are in danger of forgetting why we're fighting, or at least getting a bit confused. But the terrorists haven't, and this is an adversary with a crystal clear doctrine and a long-term plan. They have been remarkably consistent, and we haven't. It's worth reading some of Osama bin Laden's plentiful interviews and statements from the 1990s, which show the development and the adaptability of his single narrative. In 1996, he told Al-Quds al-Arabi that Arab land has either been occupied or there is a conspiracy to occupy it, which is, of course, a narrative that is still used. And buoyed by that story of the oppression of Islam and the defiance of the Islamist jihadist fighter, the single narrative became, obviously, a continuous historical line which linked successful battles against larger and more powerful armies in Afghanistan, Kashmir, Bosnia, Chechnya, Somalia, Iraq, and Algeria. And this absorbs and reshapes every time new conflicts are added. So you then have Iraq again, Syria, Afghanistan again. And the awful scenes of the evacuation of Kabul were presaged in bin Laden's 1996 declaration of jihad against America, where he stated with reference to Somalia that your impotence and your weakness were evident. And in his letter to the American people of 2002, he posed and answered two questions. Why are we fighting you, and what do we want from you? And the answer to the first was because you attacked us and you continue to attack us. The answer to the second, what do we want from you, is we call you to Islam, the last religion that has replaced all the previous religions, the religion of good manners, sincerity, mercy, fear of Allah, kindness to others, justice between people, giving the rights to people who deserve them, protection of people from oppressors and unjust acts. And then he refers directly to an injunction of the Quran, the religion which calls upon its followers to amr bil ma'ruf, to enjoin the good, and nahi anil munkar, to forbid the evil, with hand and tongue and heart. And he's scathing about the West. says, "It is saddening to tell you that you are the worst civilization witnessed by the history of mankind." And that core belief that Western society is decadent and must be saved by Islam, and the objective is to eliminate what they consider to be depraved in order to create something better and purer. And the point of my saying this is just to show that even if the groups change, there is clear consistency about this message. So when Daesh erupted on the scene in Iraq and Syria, they were utterly committed to the purification of the world through vast numbers of murders, returning civilization to the 7th century, and ultimately bringing about the apocalypse through the fulfillment of the prophecies. And these same narratives, the exact same narratives, were echoed in a recent BBC interview done by Secunda Kamani in Balkh in Afghanistan, where he quoted a madrasa student called Ainuddin, who's now a Taliban local military commander, who said, "They are not giving up Western culture, so we have to kill them. We had a government and it was overthrown. They, the Americans, started the fighting." So you can see an absolute line through. And Western governments completely fail to match that consistency. We don't have a neat doctrine. We're deeply committed to democracy, but we don't have fixity of purpose. And instead we take a fluctuating, imprecise, seasonal approach. It's very difficult to maintain our focus, and our cycles of planning and the terrorist cycles of planning are completely syncopated. So the terrorists are at their weakest and most disorganized when we have full focus against them. But it's a mistake for us to assume that when we stop, that they go away. There is nothing that would point to a reduction in their intention when the suppression is lifted. And it takes a real commitment to be actively counter-cyclical with a policy. So we're going to have to, in the West, find a way to maintain situation awareness, capabilities and focus, despite a reduction in resource and the fact that all interest has gone somewhere else. As Malcolm Chalmers wrote recently, even if NATO or the EU had the capability to replace the Americans in Afghanistan, no other country has indicated it would be prepared to fill the gap the Americans have left behind. So our will to fight has gone, but the fight hasn't gone. And this is about risk management and assurance. And we are going to have to accept a higher level of risk and a lower level of assurance, and in risk management speak, a lower level of mitigation, because given what I've said about people, we'll know even less if we can't get close to them. And it will require really difficult, a ruthless prioritization of limited resource when you can't actually provide the information that would enable you to take a judgment on how bad the risk is. So there are going to be some very difficult choices about how much effort to put on counterterrorism and where. How do you interpret a nil return on the threat? Is it because the threat isn't there, or is it because we've lost visibility of it? And is it enough just to try and fend it off, to stop terrorism manifesting? But that still leaves large parts of the world as a problem. It still leaves thousands of people in camps in Syria who were part of Daesh. And coming back to the earlier points on continuity and consistency, there's just a bigger and bigger gap in our vision. And we're going to have to rely on a network of partners who vary in reliability, but who can be devious and mercurial. History is incredibly important because it helps us think through and understand unintended consequences. And we are entering an era of unintended consequences again, I think, potentially. And arguably one of the clearest examples of unintended consequences was the Clinton era project, which I remember well, to get Osama bin Laden expelled from the Sudan. And that led him to go back to Afghanistan. And from 1996 onwards, you just see increasingly sort of vocal and bitter messages from him about it. So we need to think about Afghanistan, what might be the unintended consequences of the choices that we take next. And my final point is about history. 9/11 is becoming history. How do we remember it, and who tells the story? We're at a point where we should be thinking about how we turn a contemporary event into a historical one, which is understood in all its chaos and nuance by later generations of our diverse societies. So we need to create the space for the thought about what we tell ourselves about this shattering event in our historical narrative. And those who memorialize our history, and that's in particular our national museums and our historians, have a vital and urgent role to play. No child at school today was born when 9/11 happened, and nor were most of today's undergraduates. And despite its clear impact on the world, 9/11 is not included as part of the English national curriculum at schools. Teachers face a really difficult issue of how and whether to teach it. It might be included in citizenship or religious education or art or English or drama, but it might not. It's not in the history curriculum. And with schools juggling competing pressures to update historical narratives, it's easy to see how it either might be overlooked because it's not history, or is it history? Or perhaps it's just too difficult to teach. And yet today's children's lives have been shaped by it, even down to its impact on other parts of the curriculum. And they will hear about it from friends and family who will have their own very diverse opinions and experiences. And they'll be watching the news from Afghanistan or from Syria or Iraq or parts of Africa and wondering what on earth is really going on. And it's particularly difficult to work out how to teach about campaigns which have not gone well, but doubly important because the repercussions will shape not only our own societies, but how others perceive us and the fortunes of our adversaries. I'm going to leave it there, Sir John, and we'll have some questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Suzanne. There's a lot to think about there, and questions are coming in, and I'm sure they'll continue coming in. But I just want to have as I said at the beginning, a brief discussion between us. Just, of course, drawing on my own memory, there is no doubt that, well, of course, famously, everybody was taken by, well, people were taken by surprise on 9/11. Certainly, almost everybody I knew. But at the same time, very, very quickly, within a few hours, we had identified who was responsible, in effect. And although there was debate about that in the subsequent weeks, that identification proved to be correct. So there was a sort of understanding there, analysis there, even though the event itself was undoubtedly a surprise. And that surprise very much motivated and explained the behavior and the attitudes and the thinking which Peter was describing, which followed. One sat on, a seat in Washington and looked out the window, worried that a plane might be coming in and about to attack the building, if it was CIA headquarters, for example. So that is there. But we do have to be careful when we're talking now to remember the dangers from general hindsight. We always understand what's happened when we look back at it with all the knowledge we have now. So having put that on the table, as it were, I'd like to ask for your thoughts quickly on one sort of basic question. Here we are thinking about Afghanistan, of course, and also coincidentally 9/11, or maybe not coincidentally. But at the same time, it's necessary to remember that counterterrorism as an international priority, or priority for many governments, including, I think I'm right in saying, the United States government, when one listens to the analysts and the presentations and the conferences over the last 2 or 3 years, has either explicitly or implicitly been a lower priority. We're sort of moving out of that, and we're moving into the era of great power competition, and there are a couple of questions that reflect that point. Is that once again an example of us just not, somehow or other you've got to categorize everything, and it gets oversimplified. What do you think about that? Maybe Suzanne, if you can start, and then Peter.
Yes, thank you, Sir John. And that's one of the points that I was trying to draw out, is the difficulty that we have is that we are very cyclical, and if you look at the last 20 years, you can see that a big shift in terrorism, 9/11 or the declaration of the caliphate, they come out of a time when we weren't paying attention. The terrorism is most under control when we have the most resource directed against it. So we were very much, you were absolutely right, we were very much moving into a phase where, if you look at the UK's integrated review, it didn't say we're going to do less counterterrorism, but it did say we're going to do more of other things. And that instantly then creates this sort of attention problem, because you can't focus that much on everything. For me, a problem that I think we've had all the way through, and I think you could find different reasons for it, but I think it needs addressing now, is that although we've taken terrorism extremely seriously as a security threat, we've not taken it as seriously as a foreign policy challenge. It's not been something that diplomats really care about in the same way as security officials have really cared about it, with obvious exceptions. But to me, the sort of broader issue about essentially what do you do about a part of the world or a group of people within the world who simply don't share the same view about how it should be governed. They don't have the same values as we might have in the West. How do we find a way of coexisting? And that question could just as equally be put against, very conservative Islamist countries, of which now we have the newest incarnation in Afghanistan, as it could be put about how we coexist with China. And yet one is seen as the highest form of statecraft. So how do we cope with global superpower rivalry? And the other is something that people only really want to think about when it becomes a real problem again. And I think there should be the same diplomatic esteem and effort on both things. And for countries on the fault lines like Pakistan and Turkey, the war on terror has been a pivotal thing for their foreign policy posture the whole way through. And the next phase in Afghanistan's life will be decided by countries with very different self-interest equations to ours. So my argument, my simple answer, Sir John, is this is an element of foreign policy, and we have to treat it in the same way as we treat Russia or China, and see it as a question of how to coexist with something that is different.
Okay, Peter.
Yeah, well, just very briefly, I don't think terrorism will ever not be a high priority. Whether it will be the highest priority is another question. And I do understand people saying that because of this war on terror, there are other things that are actually equally important, if not more important, that we haven't had the opportunity to watch as closely as we should have, including competition with great powers, including China. So I understand that rationale. And I think we shouldn't be alarmed about counterterrorism being downgraded, because I don't think it will ever be downgraded to the extent that no one will pay attention anymore. What I think is much more important in terms of policy making is that we get out of this reactive modus. Policy making on terrorism, scholarship on terrorism is very much driven by events. It's often not very strategic. Let's say something like 9/11 happens, or attacks in England happen. And immediately you have a call for more resources. Often that happens. And then when nothing happens for a couple of years, those resources are then being reduced again. Now is actually a very interesting time in the history of the jihadist movement. We haven't had a lot of attacks recently, but from an intelligence point of view, for example, it is hugely interesting, and it actually is necessary to follow the transformation of that movement after the defeat in Syria and Iraq. New leaders are emerging. some people are leaving the movement. If we want to really know these people, as Suzanne says, now is the time to watch. And so I hope that whether it's the highest priority or one of the highest priority, I think what's important to me is that we will be able to engage at a high level with counterterrorism on a strategic and sustainable way, because that's really necessary in order to tackle it in the long term.
Thank you very, very much indeed. What I'd like to do now, I mean, I'll pick up straight away the questions because they're streaming in, and I'm afraid I have to be selective here, so please apologies to everybody who I don't quite manage to include. But if I can start really picking up the great power competition complication, or and anti-terrorism and priorities and all this sort of thing. And this is a question from Ewan Grant in London. How are the defence, intelligence and security communities in the Western alliances going to adjust from emphasis on anti-terrorism campaigns to great power competition? Or indeed,
that's a question for you, John.
Yeah.
No, you answer.
You go, Peter.
I think Suzanne or John, this is really for you to speak, because you probably have more experience in that world than I do.
Okay, Suzanne.
Well, I mean, we've covered some of it in what we were just saying. I think that there are some decisions to be taken about how much risk you're prepared to carry. And that was something I tried to bring out in my little preamble, but it is possible to say we will be satisfied by not letting them conduct attacks here. And that's still going to require a massive amount of effort, but it's not going to deal with, the longer term problem, which is that, we still have, as I said, thousands of people sitting in camps in Syria that we have no plan for. We have, obviously, we know now, a long-standing question mark about what's going to happen in Afghanistan and when and how it might yet become a problem again. So I don't think it is possible to say we're just going to do Russia and China, but I think it is possible to have a proper conversation about the level of risk we're going to tolerate and the level of effort we're going to put and where we're going to put it. But it would be wrong to say we're not going to tolerate any risk, but we're going to reduce resource. That's incompatible. And I think sometimes there is an expectation that the threat will be kept under control even as resource diminishes. And we have to face the fact that the removal of NATO and the US from Afghanistan reduces visibility, so increases risk. And we might have to spend more money on developing new capabilities to enable us to get to the level of the capabilities that we've lost. So that's a slightly rambling answer to say there needs to be a proper conversation about the level of risk we're prepared to carry. And we need to be honest with our citizens as well about that, because this is now going to be very, very difficult to spot when something starts to develop again. And it's going to be harder, and it is just as important in my mind as the threat from China, but in a very different way. Sorry, John.
If I could just come in and pick up Peter's challenge there on the great power competition point and so on, just to sort of suggest that maybe this sort of prioritization instinct that we have, to sort of say, well, this is top priority, second priority is going up and it's going down and so on, is a response maybe of the Western style of government and our structure of government and departments and all the rest of it. Sorry, it's noise in the background there. And that actually these things are all interlinked, and that maybe interlinked often in ways that we don't yet quite understand. And maybe what's been happening in Afghanistan is a good example of that, because clearly, the whole range of great power issues come into play in connection with the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And you can see that happening almost day by day. And yet somehow the political rhetoric is still trying to make a distinction between the two. Now, that's only the beginning of a response to the question, but it is something which has concerned me. I will go on to the next question, if I may, that I want to pick out. Now, David Landsman here. As a former British diplomat, I've often wondered whether the development of functional disciplines, counterterrorism, post-conflict, etc., has been at the expense of deep cultural and linguistic understanding. What is the right balance? And don't political leaders, as well as civilian and military officials, need to invest effort into understanding the culture of adversaries in order to be able to engage, just as success in international business requires an understanding of the counterparty? Now, that is picking up some of the points, certainly, Suzanne, you were trying to make. But Peter, can I ask you to comment on
yes, and I think it's an important point. And this is one of the weaknesses, if you want, of counterterrorism. Terrorism is often, and this is an awful metaphor, but it's the icing on the cake of something else. If we look at statistics that are collected by the University of Maryland, they show basically every year that 80% of terrorist attacks worldwide happen in the context of domestic conflicts. They are the outcome of conflicts in particular parts of the world. And even the remaining 20% of terrorist attacks are often connected in some way or another to these conflicts. That's why we have the most terrorist attacks for year on year happening in places like Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Nigeria. And clearly, there is a lot to be said in favor of saying it's actually much to fight terrorism in Afghanistan or in Nigeria is actually much more important to understand that society and to understand what's going on, to understand the conflicts that gives rise to the terrorism, rather than being a quote unquote counterterrorism specialist. So I would be in favor, I don't know exactly where the balance is and where it should be, but I would definitely be in favor of tilting that balance further in the direction of local knowledge. And speaking about Afghanistan, of course, this is another part of the 9/11 story. When after 9/11, we went into Afghanistan as the West, but we had barely any knowledge about it. I think in the UK, there were 2 people at universities who'd studied Afghanistan. I don't know how many people were in government that really understood Afghanistan. And I think that was also one of the reasons for a lot of things that went wrong. So I'm all in favor of more local cultural understanding of the places where we fight terror, rather than being a sort of generic counterterrorism specialist.
Suzanne?
I don't disagree with that. I suppose the point that I would pick up is that I think the people who understand the terrorists the best in Western governments are the counter-terrorist professionals. And so I don't think it's correct to say that there is not an understanding of the terrorist amongst the counter-terrorist community, most of whom have actually lived and worked in those countries which are problem countries. What I think there is an unhelpful boundary somewhere between counter-terrorism and security and diplomacy. And so those communities have sort of grown apart in a way that is unhelpful now, because you have a group of people who really, really do understand it. And sometimes I think there can be frustration that understanding isn't necessarily incorporated into a broader policy on an area. There's so many different things to say. You prompted, Peter, just then a memory from 2003, before I was going to deploy to Basra. And I thought, I'm a historian. I thought, I want to know everything I can about the history of this place so that when I go there, I can arguably do a better job. So I went to Heffer's bookshop in Cambridge and said, I would like to buy some books on the history of Iraq, or actually most only the Middle East, but particularly Iraq. And the shop assistant looked at me completely blankly and said, well, we don't have any books on the history of Iraq. And the point there, of course, it brings into mind, so now there is, there are corridors full of books on the history of Iraq, but that might not be very useful for wherever the next problem is. And there's a sort of something else there about the commercial way that we drive forward our agenda. So why were there no books on the history of Iraq? Probably because it wasn't fashionable, the publishers weren't interested in it, people weren't thinking to do their PhDs on it. And so you end up in this situation where you only become an expert on something after, when ideally what you would have had is an expert before. And I don't know how we fix that, in the sense that the number of times when I've pitched an idea which I thought was brilliant and someone said, oh, no one will be interested in that, everybody's interested in this. So we are constantly following the thing. And I think the concern now amongst some Afghan specialists is that we're following Afghanistan now, but next month we will simply have stopped talking about it again. So that's a real challenge for us, I think.
Can I just add one sentence?
Please.
Yes. And I think, it is very clear as we're dealing with these groups that many of these groups, if not all of these groups, essentially have two faces, or there are two aspects to them. Whether you look at Al-Shabaab or Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or any of these so-called affiliates of ISIS or of Al-Qaeda, there is a part of them is a local movement, which is really thriving on conflicts and lines of conflicts within these societies and gets support out of it. On the other hand, in almost all of these movements and groups, we do have, if you want, a very internationalized elite that have been to Syria and have been fighting there, or were in Afghanistan in the 1980s, have connections to other countries, and ideologically have much more of a transnational mindset. And it is precisely because the constant question is, which one of those two faces is the one that matters most, and which one of the two faces could assert itself in order to threaten us. And precisely because there's this duality or ambiguity, it is important to have that balance, because the person that only understands the local conflict is, and I've often experienced that, is likely to completely dismiss any international dimension. On the other hand, the people who only see these global connections are likely to miss something that is important too. So yes, I'm in favor of the balance.
Right. Now, if we can maybe also think about the sort of, the international collaborative context. Because one of the points would sort of, I think, maybe be mentioned, but it's not particularly featured when we've been talking about great power competition and counterterrorism priorities and so on, and the way they interlink. Of course, also the issue of collaboration and alliances and international cooperation between governments of a very different kind, often reliable, not reliable, and so on, different backgrounds. And anybody who's worked in this area knows that over the last 20 years in particular, that's A, changed a lot, and B, been an absolutely crucial element in all the successes that have been against terrorist activity and plotting and so on, which we tend not to talk about, of course, because one always ends up talking about the things that go wrong and the attacks that get through. Here's a question from Paul Schulter. How far is the West dependent on active, reliable cooperation from Russia and China to counter Islamic terrorism effectively at politically acceptable levels of risk? Peter.
I'm sure that Paul has something in his mind that he's trying to get at. To be honest, I don't think there is. I think I can't speak about operational collaboration. I can only tell you that when I was OSCE Special Representative in 2017, people always said to me, political masters always said to me, let's talk to Russia about countering terrorism, because that's something we all agree on, right? So that should be diplomatically, that should be an easy win, because we all hate ISIS, and surely that's something where we can collaborate. And I was sent to Moscow to speak to people, and I had lots of meetings in Interior Ministry, at the FSB, at Justice Ministry. And I quickly realized that when it comes to countering terrorism, not only have they a completely different idea of what terrorism is, they almost certainly have a completely different idea of how to counter it. And so once you get beyond this, basically it sounds like a good idea because we all hate ISIS. Once you explore the details and the nitty-gritty of it, you quickly realize how limited that cooperation will be in practice. So I didn't make a lot of headway because I found out that there isn't as much to collaborate on as I thought possible. But maybe that's different at the tactical and operational level. But this idea that because we're all enemies of ISIS and ISIS considers us enemies, that therefore we have a lot to share and work on together is not necessarily true. At least that was my experience.
Suzanne?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to be very careful of putting any store whatsoever in counterterrorism cooperation with Russia and China, except in a kind of geostrategic sense, primarily because, to pick up Peter's last point, in practical terms, they have a different idea of what human rights are and what acceptable treatment is of somebody that they arrest. And that makes it, in legal terms, very, very difficult for people, representatives of Western governments, to cooperate with them in practical terms in counter-terrorist operations, because you cannot be a part of their subsequent activities against terrorists. So I think we need, I worry that that point is probably not well enough understood. And so people make these sweeping assumptions that it's okay, we can work with the Russians and the Chinese. Well, we can't work with the Russians and the Chinese because they lock people up for indefinite periods of time and, you know, without trial, and these sort of things, which simply we couldn't allow people working for our governments to be a party to. And that's that. Sorry. The problem is that problem exists not only in Russia and China, but actually in many countries around the world, and will continue to inhibit really active counter-terrorist cooperation. And the second thing is their willingness. So you know, we might think, oh, it would be excellent to work with this country, but they may not be willing to work with us either.
Thank you very much. Now, here I have a question from Alexander Brockman. A brilliant discussion. Thank you all. How do you see the effects of climate change from the Sahel to South Asia impacting terror movements? And how well do you think Western governments are at currently approaching this from a foreign policy rather than a security framework? Suzanne.
I'm going to pick this one up slightly by replying to another question lower down from Ewan Duncan, who says, Suzanne appears to assume that terrorist threats in the UK will emanate from Afghanistan and the Taliban. And it's the same sort of thing. It's the question about whether geography matters to terrorist groups. And there is an argument that says geography doesn't matter, because you can be sitting in the middle of London, you can be sitting in the middle of a crowded city and be planning a terrorist attack. You don't have to be in the Sahel or in Afghanistan. And that's the culture and the idea of the sort of global jihad movement is very powerful if you are susceptible to it wherever you are. That notwithstanding, clearly having territory makes a difference. And so being able to control a place of ground, whether it's in the Sahel, whether it's in Afghanistan, whether it's in Syria and Iraq, enables you to then, recruit, plan, practice without the same kind of interference that you would otherwise. So the question about whether climate change making those places less hospitable makes a difference to what the terrorist groups might do. And I suppose if I'm being a little bit harsh on the climate change thing, I would say they're already pretty inhospitable. There's already a massive level of, sort of local grievances about all sorts of things. I can't see that the worsening of those locations is particularly going to be a driver that makes terrorism worse. It will probably increase instability across a wider area, but it's already pretty bad. I don't know, Peter, you probably...
Well, I think you're right. However, I think you have to take it almost like a little step further, in the sense that when you're thinking about what does climate change cause, it may cause people to migrate. It may actually, of course, cause deprivation in various forms. Of course, these are not really places where a lot of agriculture is being done, but some agriculture is being done, and that is important, and it threatens that, it deprives people. And we know, of course, that these are sorts of factors that in turn may provide opportunities for terrorist groups to exploit and to gain support. So it creates a more conducive environment. It creates a sort of environment where you have, as you say, instability. And instability, as we know from ISIS more than anything, basically suits their agenda. I think that's basically behind what ISIS is trying to do in Afghanistan. It is trying to create chaos because it's learned from Libya and from Syria and Iraq that in conditions of chaos, an organization like ISIS thrives. And with climate change, that may be another driver of this sort of instability and chaos and conflict that produces favorable situations that can be exploited by terrorists. So I think it's a two-step. It's, yes, climate change leads to instability, and instability in turn can be exploited by terrorists.
Right. Well, now we're moving towards the end, and so probably only time for another couple of questions. I have to admit that I think we've now got 38 questions on the list here. Now, if we can just turn to maybe the immediate or effective impact, in particular, of what's been going on in Afghanistan. And this is a question from Andrew Cooper. Having now achieved victory in Afghanistan, how likely is it that any of the fundamentalist Islamic groups will risk a major attack on the West that could prompt a serious US response? I mean, that's a particular way of tackling that question. Maybe Suzanne and then Peter. But please interrupt each other if you want to.
Thank you. So I suppose the first point would be that presupposes that the group that conducts the attack, which may have been planned in Afghanistan, actually is within the command and control structure of the Taliban. For me, I wrote something last week about thinking again about unintended consequences. There's a number of things that could now happen in Afghanistan, and in a depressing way. There are two things that could happen that could make things even worse, and they essentially come from continuity of contest in Afghanistan. So if if the Taliban is now challenged consistently by resistance movements, whatever they may be, possibly supported by Western governments, maybe, who knows, then you create a sort of imperative to fight jihad on behalf of, in support of the Taliban. And that has the potential to draw in, again, all those other groups which exist in that area. Particularly, I had a particular focus on the Kashmiri jihadi groups like Lashkar-e-Toiba, which of course was born in Afghanistan in the 1980s, and which for the UK is particularly, any link between the Kashmiri groups and a new jihad would potentially create additional risk in the UK, because we have such a large Kashmiri population here. And what we saw in the last Afghan jihad was that a small number, but it was a significant number in terms of the threat, went out through Pakistan to Afghanistan to do jihad there, and then they come back, and it might take 10 years, before the threat manifests, but it does in the end. And the other point, obviously, is that branding rivalry now between the Taliban and Daesh, who's more legitimate, who's more nimble and angrier and more brutal. The best possible outcome, which is not a good outcome, is that the Taliban is victorious over Daesh quickly. But you have then two bad outcomes. One is that they reach an accommodation of sorts and become some sort of umbrella thing. I don't know how that would work. I actually don't think that's going to happen at the moment. And the second is that you have a protracted contest there. And so you have, it used to be the armies of black flags in the lands of Khorasan, but actually now you have negative, so the black and white flags in different, in a negative of each other. But that becomes a jihadist rallying cry. So go and fight for Daesh against the Taliban, who are conniving with the Americans. Heaven forfend, how on earth this is happening. So that becomes then a draw, which again it's not going to be that the terrorists, they're going to say we'll do an attack next year. It could be 5 years, it could be 10 years, but we just won't know. And we have to assume that more people will travel to Afghanistan in any of those scenarios, and then they might travel somewhere else and carry out an attack somewhere else.
Peter.
Just very briefly, I think it's a great question, and it sort of predicates the idea that the Taliban, it wouldn't be in the Taliban's interest to allow for a systematic presence of internationally oriented terrorist groups or turn against the West, is in principle correct, but it is based on two assumptions. Is based on the assumption that the political leadership of the Taliban, who we are hearing a lot from, who are sort of negotiating with the West in Doha in Qatar, led by Baradar, the leader of the sort of political part of the Taliban, that these people are leading a coherent, united movement that is fully controlled by them. Right. So if everyone follows their line, I think your questioner is right. However, we cannot be sure about that. Unfortunately, there are different factions within the Taliban. We've already seen a number of incidents carried out by commanders on the ground who clearly have different ideas about the speed and pragmatism with which the Taliban should implement their program. We, of course, also have a difficult relationship between the Taliban, or a complex relationship, let me put it like that, between the Taliban and the so-called Haqqani network, which is part of the Taliban, but which is also heavily linked to Al-Qaeda. So I think, yes, there is pragmatism coming out of the political leadership, and I do believe them when they say we've learned from the mistakes of the past and we don't want to repeat them. The question is, are they fully in charge of their movement? Will they be able to control their movement for the foreseeable future? And the other question, or the other assumption is, of course, and that's something that Suzanne was already talking about, is to what extent will the Taliban, led by whoever, be able to control the entire country? Because the other risk is, of course, that you will have significant parts of the country where the Taliban are not able to assert full control, and where you will have pockets of places where you have lots of militias fighting against each other, and groups like ISIS exploiting that sort of quote-unquote vacuum of power in order to assert themselves. So yes, I agree, but it's based on a lot of assumption whose veracity we do not know how it will play out.
That is a very key point, of course. And it's just reminding us of the complexity of what we're dealing with, and also the need to be very cautious as we watch many of the headlines. I'm afraid we are coming to the end now. I had quite wanted to pick up a question, but it is reflected in a number of the comments that are here. I think we're up to 41 now, which is that an underlying theme in what you've been saying is that we do need to have an overall strategic approach, lots of levels of expertise, but there needs to be a coherent and consistent strategy. And therefore, the governments, Western governments, however we define ourselves, the governments of the liberal democracies, I think perhaps that's the best way of putting it, need somehow or another to build up that strategic capacity. I'm not asking you to comment in detail on that, we haven't got time, but can you just say whether you agree that that is a central question or maybe not?
Yes, I agree. And it's also reflecting what I said before, in a sense, because my big critique of counterterrorism policy, and I think that this is also coming out of 9/11, and our response to 9/11 is that our response to terrorism and challenges posed by terrorism has always and historically been driven by events. And I understand where that is coming from. And it is inevitable to some extent, because once there's an event like 9/11, there will be a lot of political and public pressure. But I think in the long term, we have to get to some extent a little bit away from that and argue and convince political leaders that it is important to sustain investment in these areas, both in counterterrorism and prevention, even if there's no attack for a couple of years.
Okay, thank you. Suzanne, very quickly.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I would say invest more in assessment and analysis in government, and we have that on terrorism. We have it in very small numbers across the whole scope of foreign security policy. And if we put more resource in assessment and analysis, and that put more time into thinking before we do things, it might be slightly better, but it's always difficult. It's just difficult to get it right. So
yeah, but I understand that completely. I have to say, but look, that has been a very brain-provoking and intellectually provoking discussion. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much indeed to everyone who asked questions. I'm sorry that I was only able to pick up a few, but the questions definitely demonstrate the intellectual depth and commitment to this issue, and the challenge really that we now face, and we've been facing for a long time, but we're perhaps just a bit more conscious of it and of its complexity. So a big thank you to RUSI, of course, and the Military History Programme for what they've set in train. And I do want to take this opportunity to say that the next webinar in the Military History series is going to be on the 14th of October at 4 o'clock. It's on the website. It's by Miriam Granda-Mantas, a colonel in the Dutch Army, who will present her book on Afghanistan entitled Inescapable Entrapments, Civil Military Decision Paths to Ursugan and Helmand. So that's on important detail. So thank you very much once again, everybody, and really to Peter and to Suzanne.